Good morning. We're going to be reading chapters 11 and 12 of Forbidden Schoolhouse. Chapter 11 is entitled Miss Crandall on Trial. Early in the morning of August 22nd, Pardon Crandall drove his daughter and 8 of her students to the Brooklyn courthouse. After weeks of waiting, Prudence was going to be put on trial for operating a school for African Americans who came from outside of Connecticut. The 8 girls had been called as witnesses. None of the women ever described how they had felt as Pardon's wagon jounced along the road that day, but all 9 must have been nervous. The girls were going to take the witness stand in a courtroom crowded with white strangers. They were going to face a battery is like an attack, of hostile lawyers who might trick them into saying things that could hurt their teacher, damage their school, and end their chances of getting an education. So remember, one of those persuasive techniques is to use manipulation. It's a bad technique. It's a damaging technique, but it is still a technique that many lawyers will use to try and kind of turn words against somebody, or, oh, well, you said this. Does that mean this about Mrs. Crandall? And so it's very, very intimidating to be put on trial. For Prudence, the entire future was on the line. If the court found her guilty, she would face jail, fines, and the loss of her school. Prudence was not the sort of woman who showed her fears, but it must have been hard to look calm as she made her way into the crowded courtroom. The session was scheduled to start at 9, and the lawyers were waiting. On one side of the room, the tall, dignified Williams Ellsworth conferred with 2 of his assistants. Ellsworth, a U.S. congressman and one of Connecticut's finest attorneys, was there to defend Prudence. On the other side of the courtroom, in their formal frock coats, were the 2 prosecuting attorneys, Prudence's old enemy, Andrew Judson, and his colleague, Jonathan Welch. The presiding judge entered and took his seat. The jury was chosen. To Ellsworth, it was clear from the start that the opposition had an unfair advantage. So he already saw that this was very turned against Prudence. The judge was an old business associate of Andrew Judson's, who had helped the legislature write the law that Prudence was accused of breaking. So already we see an incredible injustice going on. The judge is completely biased against Prudence. Not only is he friends with Andrew Judson, but also he is one of the legislators that helped create the law that she is now being accused of breaking. Okay, so this is really quite bad. Prosecution lawyers were allowed to rudely refer to Prudence as Prudy, and one juror had actually helped pass the black law. So even the jury themselves were biased. They were biased against her. They were people that had been involved in this. And then throughout the whole thing, they're like calling her Prudy. Okay? Yeah, that's a nickname for Prudence, but this is not a time for nickname. That's very, very disrespectful. Calling someone Buddy or Hun or Prudy, and that's a level of disrespect that they're giving her. Getting a fair verdict from a court like that might be hard, but Ellsworth and his associates had tackled tough cases before. Patiently, they waited as the prosecution called Ann Peterson, a pupil from New York, up to the stand. Ann was an out-of-state student. If she answered questions truthfully about attending the Crandall School, she might also be accused of breaking the black law, and Ellsworth didn't want that to happen. Before Prosecutor Welch could begin his examination, Mr. Ellsworth had advised the witnesses not to answer any questions. So remember, one of the rights that we have, the Fifth Amendment, says that you have the right to remain silent, because then no words can be used against you. So that's what he's told these girls that they should probably do. That was a blow, but Welch tried anyways. Has Miss Crandall kept a school for colored misses who are not inhabitants of this state? He asked the girl on the stand. Miss Patterson refused to reply. Again, the attorney tried. Has Miss Crandall instructed any person of color other than yourself? Again, Ann was silent. Frustrated, Welch excused Ann and called 2 other out-of-state students. On Ellsworth's advice, both of them refused to answer. The day was warm. The room grew hot. One after another, the witnesses took the stand, and again, Mr. Welch asked the same questions. But no one admitted that Prudence had actually taught black girls from outside of Connecticut. By the end of the first day, the prosecution had not made much progress. On the second morning, Mr. Welch called a new witness, student Eliza Glasgow. Like the others, Eliza refused to answer. But this time, the prosecution had had enough. Mr. Welch turned to the judge. If the witness won't answer questions, she should be jailed for contempt of court, he said. The judge agreed and gave an order. The bailiff started to march Eliza off to prison, But suddenly, William Ellsworth spoke up. He didn't want to see a young girl go to jail. Besides, Eliza came from Connecticut. If she admitted attending the Crandall school, she couldn't be charged with breaking the black law. She could answer the prosecution lawyer, Ellsworth said. So the one girl that they had it, they were really, really fed up. So now they're going to start a new thing. They're going to, now if you're going to stay silent, then we're going to call you with being contempt of court. And then Ellsworth is like, ooh, they can ask this girl questions because she is from Connecticut. So she can't get in trouble. So, it's really kind of interestingly working out. Now that he finally had a cooperative witness, Welch hurled questions. Could Eliza show the court any student who came from outside of Connecticut? She pointed to a girl from Rhode Island and 2 pupils from New York. And what were those girls taught? Mr. Welch wanted to know. Reading, writing, grammar, geography, Eliza answered. That was enough. Mr. Welch called his next witness, Mary Benson. Sorry. Thank you, Indy. One of Prudence's friends and the sister of Ann Benson, who had shared Prudence's prison cell. Miss Benson took the oath. That's where you are taking the oath on the Bible that you will not tell a lie, that you will say what you have seen or heard. The spectators listened, and the attorney asked his most important question. Who taught the girls in Mrs. Crandall's school? Miss Benson had no choice. She had sworn to tell the truth. Reluctantly, she admitted that she had seen Prudence teaching the classes. It was all the prosecution needed. Mr. Welch had proved that Prudence had taught black girls from out of state in her school. He had proved that she had broken the law. Mr. Welch sat down and Andrew Judson rose to sum up the case for the prosecution. It was clear, he told the jury, that Miss Crandall had broken the Connecticut black law. Now, some people might say that the law was unfair, Judson pointed out. They might say that it took away the rights from black people. But, he said, the law couldn't take away black rights because blacks had no rights. Ooh, what a blow, right? He's saying, some people are going to look at this and be like, oh, that's not fair. It's taking away their rights. He's kind of mocking them and saying, I'm sorry, they don't have any rights. Remember, this is before the 14th Amendment. There are no civil rights for African Americans. And so he's not wrong. But oh my, is he going to have to answer for those words? They didn't have the right to go to school, and they certainly didn't have the right to travel freely from one state to another. Why? Because, Mr. Judson said, blacks, even free blacks, were not American citizens. And that was true. Not American citizens? To the jury, that wasn't a surprising argument. In 1833, the Constitution did not specifically say that blacks were U.S. citizens, and courts were sometimes asked to decide whether or not African Americans were entitled to full citizenship rights. The jury listened as Andrew Judson finished up his speech. Now it was Mr. Ellsworth's turn to reply. So this is that rebuttal and response. Standing in front of the jury, Prudence's lawyer began to make his case. Hang on. Honey, you can't put this around your neck. What? What you like? Okay. Sorry. Yes, the defense lawyer said, there was no doubt about it. Prudence had taught African American children from out of state. She had broken the Connecticut black law. But that was not the issue here. The real question was, did the law Prudence broke violate the United States Constitution? The Constitution is the most important set of laws in America, and all other laws had to agree with it. Remember, the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights says that states can make whatever laws they want, but they cannot break the Constitution. They have to be in agreement with the Constitution. And so that's what he's saying. That the issue is not whether she broke the law. It's very clear that she broke this law. But is the law actually an okay law? Is it a just law? Does it match the Constitution? Is it legal? Carefully, he explained his points. The Connecticut black law said that African Americans from other states could not travel to Connecticut to be educated. But the Constitution said something different. It said that all U.S. citizens could travel freely from one state to another. And, said Mr. Ellsworth, African Americans were U.S. citizens. They were born in America like other citizens. They had fought for freedom in the American Revolution like other citizens. And besides, there was nothing in the Constitution that said black people were not full-fledged, 100% American citizens. So he's actually using that argument against them and saying, you're right, it doesn't say that they are, but there's also nothing that says that they aren't. This is his counter-argument. Because the Connecticut Black Law violated the rights of African American citizens, it violated the U.S. Constitution. It was a bad law, and breaking it is no crime. So St. Augustine said this years and years and years ago, where he said an unjust law is no law at all. Okay? So that's a very much something that the Enlightenment group was kind of jumping on, and that's what Ellsworth is saying. It's okay to break an unjust law because it was unjust. It was not okay in the first place. Therefore, Mr. Ellsworth explained, Prudence was not guilty. The lawyers were finished, and now it was up to the jury. The 12 men filed out. In the courtroom, Prudence and her friends waited. Everything was riding on the jury's verdict. Slowly, the hours ticked by. People chatted or walked outside to get a breath of air. Men glanced impatiently at their watches. And then finally, the door opened and the jurors filed back in. But when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict, the foreman shook his head. The jury, he reported, could not decide. The judge asked them to reconsider, and the spectators waited. Time passed. The door opened again, but the message was the same. No verdict. Again, the judge ordered the jury to review the case. But when the jurors returned for a third time, there was still no decision. Some members of the jury had believed the prosecution, or the people against, like Judson. Some had believed the defense, like Ellsworth. 7 jurors thought that Prudence was guilty. 5 were sure that she was innocent. The jury was hopelessly split. Nothing had been decided, and for Prudence, the ordeal was not over. The case would have to be heard again, and a new trial was then set for December. So remember, this is August 22nd. That's going to be 4 months away. She has to wait for a new trial with a new judge and new jury. Okay, chapter 12 is called More Trouble. There were no end to the insults, no end to the meanness. At least that's the way it must have seemed one August day when Prudence's housekeeper, Mariah Davis, hauled a bucket of water out of the school well. To her surprise, the pail was full of smelly brown muck. Someone had dumped a load of manure into their well. I mean, this is just such incredibly low blows that these people are deciding to do to Prudence and these students. It was a dirty and disgusting trick, but Prudence couldn't afford to get upset over every outrage. Besides, at first, it didn't seem like a major problem. There were other places to get water. A neighbor who lived only a few steps away had a roadside well that he often let travelers use. But when a student tried to fetch a pail of water, the neighbor refused to let her have a single drop. While that was unpleasant, still the situation wasn't alarming. There was another well nearby, but when Prudence asked to use it, the owner said no. None of the neighbors wanted to give her any water, he explained. That was serious. Water was a necessity. If the neighbors wouldn't help, Prudence would have to get along without them. Again, she turned to her family, and once again, Pardon hitched up his wagon. He hauled barrels of water to the school every day until his daughter managed to get a well in the school basement working. So now he has, no thank you. Okay. Yeah. You want this? Sorry. Prudence told the girls not to indulge in angry feelings towards their enemies. The girls, one student reported in an essay, tried to remember that they should not return evil for evil. But it was probably hard not to be angry as the difficulties mounted. Such incredible character that we're seeing from these people who are going through abuse and being bullied more than I haven't met many people that have gone through this kind of human disgust and human just evilness towards them. And yet they are trying so hard to be like Jesus. they are trying to not indulge in angry feelings towards them. They're trying not to return evil for evil. They're trying to keep their hearts pure and not let the devil be able to take over in their heart and respond in a way that would be evil back. It's impressive. When a student fell ill, Prudence called the nearest doctor, Andrew Harris. Grudgingly, Dr. Harris walked across the street and examined the sick girl, but he didn't plan to waste time on another black patient. "You need not send for me again," the doctor said as he left. "I shall not come if you do." It's fascinating to me because the doctor's code, of course, is that they can do no harm. And refusing to see a patient that could be sick or dying is refusing harm. So not only in a worldly way are they, betraying their code of being a doctor, as a Christian, which many of these people at this time were, and as a non-Christian. I mean, everyone will have to answer for their actions. He will have to answer for refusing to help someone who is in need based off of his prejudice. Worse yet, in September, Andrew Judson began to stir up trouble. The school was in his way, and despite all his efforts, the stubborn teacher and her black pupils were still sitting in the big white house in the middle of town. Judson couldn't walk out the front door of his own fancy mansion without seeing Mrs. Crandall's academy across the street, and he wanted that place closed down. Of course, the school would have to shut if Prudence was declared guilty at her new trial in December, but Andrew Judson didn't want to wait that long. With the help of a few well-placed friends, he managed to get the process moving. The results were instantaneous. On September 26th, the Canterbury sheriff tried to arrest Prudence again. This time, however, friends paid her bail before the town authorities could haul her off to prison. One day later, on September 27th, there was another unpleasant surprise. The date of Prudence's new trial had been moved. Instead of being held in December, as originally planned, it was now scheduled to take place in 6 days. No one was ready. Samuel May was out of town. Prudence's chief lawyer, Mr. Ellsworth, wasn't available. His 2 colleagues had no time to prepare. Prudence barely even had time to gather her thoughts before the court session opened at 9 a.m. on October 3rd, 1833. So now they've rushed. They've sped the trial up, and now it's in 6 days. You have a week, less than a week, to plan. And she doesn't have her lawyer. He's, in 6 days, you can't always even travel. I mean, travel back then was by horse and buggy. So he's not even able to come. They're trying to catch her in this. For those who had watched the first trial, it was a little like seeing a rerun. Once again, Prudence sat in the courtroom listening to the arguments, scanning the jury box, and wondering what the jurors were thinking. Again, the prosecution lawyers argued that Prudence had broken the Connecticut black law by teaching African American girls. And again, the defense argued that breaking the Connecticut law did not matter because blacks were U.S. citizens, and the black law violated the rights given to African American citizens in the U.S. Constitution. The arguments were the same, but the jury was different, and so was the judge. Presiding judge was David Daggett. He was a well-dressed man with a lordly manner and an actor's booming voice. 2 years earlier, he had helped stop abolitionists from opening a school for African American men in New Haven. He didn't think much of black people, and he was not shy about saying so. So, the community has drudged up a biased man who has, as a judge, shut down African American schools in the past. Mrs. Crandall's lawyers were dead wrong, Judge Daggett told the jury. The Connecticut black law did not violate the rights given to black citizens. It couldn't do that because blacks were not American citizens. They were, his quote, a degraded caste of inferior rank and condition in society. They had no constitutional rights, and the U.S. Constitution had nothing to do with the Crandall case. The jury, he said, had to deal with just one single fact. Prudence Crandall had broken a Connecticut state law. The 12 jurors listened carefully and left the room. And when they returned, the verdict was guilty. Obviously. I mean, they definitely rigged this. Prudence's lawyers, though, weren't going to settle for this. Before Judge Daggett could sentence Prudence to fines or imprisonment, they filed an appeal asking that the Supreme Court of Errors, the highest, most powerful court in Connecticut, review the case and decide if the guilty verdict was correct. The process would take months. In the meantime, however, Prudence was free, and the school was open. More students were enrolling. Andrew Judson and the Canterbury townsfolks had not won yet. Our author gives us kind of a word here, right? They had not won yet. Okay. They're implying that there is a possibility that they hurt her in some way, that there is repercussions from all of this in this. So notice what they've done. This is the local level. This was all within their town, the Canterbury Town Council. So that's where most local acts of crime, acts of embezzlement, acts of disobedience, they're taken care of at the local level, usually at the county level. So for example, if somebody commits a crime in St. Joe or in Berrien Springs, they're going to go to trial at the county level, which we are the Berrien Springs County. Berrien Springs County includes Benton Harbor, St. Joseph, Stevensville, Berrien Springs. Just kind of all of that area is Berrien County. Remember, counties are a little larger than towns. And the county courthouse, some of you may be familiar with it, it's in Benton Harbor, right there when you're going across the bridge, right there by the Mexican restaurant, before you go down to Silver Beach. So that's where this would be taking place. Now, when they came up with a guilty verdict, they are now appealing, they're requesting this to be taken to the state level, the Supreme Court of Connecticut. So now they're bringing it to the state level, local to state. At the state level, they're going to discuss it. If a law or if something gets an appeal to go then to the Supreme Court of the nation, that would then go to Washington, D.C., and it would be brought to trial against the Constitution. This would be one of those laws that could easily get to the Supreme Court in Washington. Because like I said, most people like murder trials and things like that, those don't go to the Supreme Court. What goes to the Supreme Court in Washington are constitutional issues, whether or not something is violating the Constitution. So this is an exact example of one that might go there. We'll see whether this ends up going all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. But right now, she's free because they have appealed for it to go to Connecticut State Supreme Court. Michigan, of course, has a state Supreme Court. Our state Supreme Court is in Lansing, Michigan at the Capitol building. So that's kind of the levels of government. All right, our question today. A couple of things. I want us to kind of go back to discussing in chapter 11, where it talks about how we talk about civil disobedience, disobeying respectfully, saying, I'm not following this law because the law itself is unjust. So I kind of want you to be thinking about that, about whether you agree an unjust law is no law at all. Is that true? You don't need to answer that in your question, but I just kind of want you to be thinking about that. The question that we have today is thinking about Prudence and these girls who are experiencing unimaginable abuses. And they are experiencing this from their neighbors, from people that they knew. And it says here on page 80, Prudence told the girls not to indulge in angry feelings towards their enemies. The girls reported that they were trying hard to remember not to return evil with evil. So I want you, in your own personal reflection time, to jot down how hard you kind of feel that this might have been for the girls. And then I'd like you to think of like a modern issue. Obviously, we're not dealing with, African Americans getting the right to go to school. That is obviously something that we aren't dealing with today. But there are injustices. We're talking about these injustices right now during our unit. I want you to think of injustices or ways that people can be treated within their school, within their families, within their friendship groups, within their partners, dating relationship or marriage relationships, or within sibling relationships, teacher to student relationships. What is a way that somebody could inflict pain? Pain that in a human sense deserves a punch back or a spiteful word, or deserves our bitterness or our anger. And yet, as Christians, we believe not to indulge in those angry feelings. What would be an experience where this happened and the person involved in it would have a hard time forgiving? Okay, that's what this is a hard topic. People can be very cruel I want you to explain a modern issue. What is a modern issue that could happen to you? Maybe it happened to you. Maybe it hasn't happened to you, but you've seen it happen to somebody else. Or maybe it's all hypothetical and none of this has ever happened to you. Praise the Lord. But you can imagine something modern today. Maybe it's a race issue. Maybe it is an unkindness. Maybe it is a series of, bullying. Maybe it's just an insult. Maybe it's just the way that somebody is talking or treating somebody. Maybe it's an abuse that's coming from somebody in a family. What is something difficult that people struggle with wanting to return with evil? Okay, we're looking at modern issues that would be something that would be hard to forgive, something that is a challenge to forgive. And then I want you to share, how do you think Jesus expects us to respond to that? Does he expect us to just ignore it? Does he expect us to not talk about it and get over it? Does he expect us to address it? Does he expect us to stand up against it? Does he expect us to tattle? Does he expect us to blow it off and get tougher skin and, you know what, I just need to forget about it? Does he expect us to cry about it and whine about it? Does he expect us to complain to others about it? Does he expect us to share it with other people? Does he expect us to return it with evil? Does he expect us to get violent or protest it in a way that really might get your point across? I mean, what are we supposed to do with it? Because if it hasn't happened to you already, it will happen to you. And we as Christians have to wrestle with this. How are we called to respond when the world, not even the world, when Christians, everyone in this book has been a Christian, when Christians respond in hurtful and hateful ways, how do we not return evil for evil? All right. Lots of deep thoughts to think about today. Looking forward to your responses. Have a great day.